April 1945, the Second World War was entering its final chapter. Across Europe, Nazi Germany was collapsing under the weight of Allied advances. Every day, thousands of German soldiers laid down their weapons. Many would never return to the battlefield. Instead, they would find themselves thousands of miles away, behind barbed wire, in prisoner of war camps across the United States. Under the Geneva Convention, America had a clear obligation. Every prisoner was to receive food, shelter, medical care. Even if that prisoner had once fought against American forces, it was a promise the United States intended to keep. And every morning before the Arizona desert had fully awakened, one Army nurse helped fulfill that promise. Her name was Marie Collins. History remembers the generals who planned campaigns, the presidents who made impossible decisions, the soldiers who stormed beaches under enemy fire. Far fewer people remember the nurse who quietly walked from bed to bed, checking temperatures, changing dressings, recording symptoms, and keeping wounded men alive. Yet without people like Marie Collins, armies could not function. Wars are fought on battlefields. They are sustained in hospitals. Papago Park prisoner of war camp stood just outside Phoenix, Arizona. By the final months of the war, it housed German prisoners captured in North Africa and Europe. Some were recovering from illness, others from injuries. Every one of them depended on military medical staff. Marie Collins was responsible for many of those patients. Her routine rarely changed. Before sunrise, she reported for duty. Medical charts were reviewed. Temperatures were taken. Bandages were replaced. Medication was carefully documented. The work demanded discipline, precision, and consistency. Inside the ward, every mistake carried consequences. Infection did not care about nationality. Pain did not recognize uniforms. Medicine followed its own rules. Those rules required every patient to receive the same standard of care. Marie believed in those rules. She lived by them every single day. But outside the hospital, a different set of rules governed her life. Marie Collins wore the same Army uniform as every other military nurse. She had completed the required professional training. She had accepted the same oath of service. She carried the same responsibility for human life. Yet she served in an army that remained segregated by race. Across much of the military, black service members lived separately from white service members. Facilities were often separated. Assignments frequently reflected racial policy rather than professional ability. The contradiction was striking. The United States trusted Marie Collins to care for captured enemy soldiers. It did not yet trust Black Americans with equal treatment inside their own armed forces. That contradiction became even more remarkable inside prisoner of war hospitals. Many German prisoners had spent years living under Nazi ideology, a system built upon racial hierarchy. Some carried those beliefs with them into captivity. Historical accounts from Black Army nurses describe moments when German prisoners expressed racist attitudes toward the very women responsible for their care. The nurses continued their work anyway, not because prejudice disappeared, but because professionalism demanded something greater. Every pulse was checked. Every wound was cleaned. Every fever was treated. The standards never changed because of the opinions of the patient lying in the bed. It was a quiet form of courage, one repeated hundreds of times, without applause, without recognition, often without anyone outside those hospital walls ever knowing it had happened. Marie Collins rarely appeared in newspaper headlines. She left behind no famous battlefield memoir, no celebrated speech, no military command like thousands of Army nurses. Her contribution was measured differently. One patient at a time, one shift at a time, one life at a time. But to understand why her service was so extraordinary, we have to step away from Papago Park for a moment, because the greatest obstacle Marie Collins ever faced was not a German prisoner. It was a policy that had shaped the lives of Black American nurses long before the Second World War began. For decades, qualified Black women had volunteered to serve their country. For decades, their country had answered with the same response: no. That forgotten history would determine almost every step Marie Collins took during the war, and it explains why one of America's most dedicated military nurses found herself caring for enemy prisoners. While still fighting to be treated as an equal in the nation she served, long before Marie Collins ever walked into the prison hospital at Papago Park, another generation of Black nurses had already begun a battle of their own. It was not fought with rifles. There were no trenches, no artillery, no victory parades. The battlefield was a stack of applications on a military desk. In 1917, as the United States entered the First World War, the Army urgently needed nurses. Hospitals expanded almost overnight. Casualties increased. Medical staff became critically short. Thousands of women volunteered. Among them were Black nurses who had completed the same rigorous training required of every professional nurse. Many believed that a nation preparing to send young Americans into war would welcome anyone qualified to save their lives. Instead, their applications were rejected, not because they lacked education, not because they lacked experience, but because Army policy excluded them. Only when the influenza pandemic of 1918 overwhelmed military hospitals did the Army reluctantly accept a small number of Black nurses. Even then, many found themselves assigned duties beneath their level of training. When the crisis passed, so did most of the opportunities. The lesson was unmistakable. Their country needed their labor. It still hesitated to accept them as equals. More than 20 years later, history repeated itself. As war spread across Europe once again, America began preparing for another global conflict. Black nurses volunteered in large numbers. Many hoped the mistakes of the previous generation would not be repeated. Instead, many received rejection letters explaining that existing Army regulations did not provide positions for Black nurses in the Army Nurse Corps. It was a contradiction that became harder to defend with each passing year. The United States was preparing to confront Nazi Germany, a regime that preached racial superiority, yet racial barriers remained embedded within America's own military. Pressure slowly mounted. Civil rights organizations protested. Black newspapers questioned the policy. Some political leaders also began urging change. The Army eventually expanded opportunities for Black nurses, but the change came gradually and under pressure. By 1944, hundreds of Black nurses were serving in uniform. Even so, their assignments were rarely equal. Most were sent to hospitals treating Black American soldiers, or to prisoner of war hospitals caring for captured German troops. That was the world Marie Collins entered, not because her abilities were different, but because segregation still shaped military policy. At Papago Park, the work never slowed. Every patient required careful attention. Medical records had to be accurate. Medication schedules had to be followed precisely. The routine demanded concentration. There was little room for error. Marie Collins understood that professionalism was not something to display only when circumstances were easy. It mattered most when circumstances were difficult. The men she treated had once fought against American forces. Some had survived campaigns in North Africa. Others had fought across Europe. Now they depended upon the care of American military nurses. The Geneva Convention required humane treatment for prisoners of war. Marie never questioned that obligation. She fulfilled it every day. Yet the hospital reflected the contradictions of the wider world. Historical accounts from Black Army nurses describe an environment where they often found themselves respected for their medical skill. While simultaneously limited by segregation, their uniforms represented the United States. Their daily experience reminded them that equal service did not yet guarantee equal treatment. The contradiction became painfully clear during one incident remembered by several former nurses. A German prisoner identified in historical accounts as Karl Wilhelm openly expressed racist contempt toward black nurses. This insult itself was deeply offensive, but what followed left an even deeper impression. The nurses reported the incident through military channels, expecting that their concerns would be taken seriously. According to later recollections, no meaningful disciplinary action followed. For many of the women involved, the silence became the lasting memory. Not because they expected special treatment, but because they believed the Army would defend the dignity of its own personnel. Instead, they were left with the unsettling realization that, even while wearing the uniform of the United States, their own status remained uncertain within the institution they served. Karl Wilhelm was only one prisoner. The larger story was never about him. It was about the system surrounding him. One man could express prejudice. A nation had the power to reject it or to tolerate it. For Marie Collins and hundreds of Black Army nurses, that distinction mattered. Every morning, they continued reporting for duty. Every morning, they cared for patients according to the highest professional standards, not because the work had become easier, but because they refused to let prejudice define the quality of their service. Without speeches, without public recognition, their professionalism became its own quiet argument against racism. One patient, one treatment, one shift at a time. By the spring of 1945, Germany stood on the edge of defeat. Across Europe, Allied forces closed in on Berlin. Inside the prison hospital at Papago Park, however, the routine remained unchanged. Charts were updated, dressings were replaced, medicine was dispensed. The war was ending. But for Marie Collins, the question that had followed her since the day she first put on the uniform had not yet been answered. America ever recognized the service of its black nurses as equal to that of everyone else? History would answer that question, but not as quickly as they had hoped. In May 1945, Germany surrendered. Across the United States, church bells rang, factory whistles sounded. Crowds gathered in city streets as newspapers announced the end of the war in Europe. For millions of Americans, it was a day of celebration. For Marie Collins, it was simply another day in uniform. The prisoners under her care still needed medicine. Dressings still had to be changed. Medical charts still had to be completed. Victory did not end a nurse's responsibilities. It simply changed the world outside the hospital. As the military rapidly reduced its wartime forces, thousands of nurses returned to civilian life. Among them were many of the black women who had spent years serving in segregated units. They had worn the same uniform, accepted the same responsibilities, worked the same long hours. Yet many left the Army, having never received the same opportunities routinely available to many of their white colleagues. The contradiction that had followed them throughout the war did not disappear with Germany's surrender. It simply became harder to justify. During the conflict, the United States had asked Black Americans to help defend democracy against regimes built on racial hierarchy. Now the nation faced a difficult question of its own. Could it continue asking for equal sacrifice while denying equal opportunity? The answer would not come immediately. But the war had changed the conversation. More than 1 million Black Americans had served in uniform during World War II. Thousands more had supported the war effort in factories, shipyards, railroads, and military hospitals. Their contribution could no longer be dismissed as marginal. It had become part of the nation's victory. Civil rights organizations increased their demands for reform. Black newspapers continued documenting unequal treatment within the armed forces. Veterans returned home, determined that the freedoms they had defended overseas should be reflected in the country they had fought for. The pressure steadily grew. 3 years after the war ended, change finally reached the highest level of government. On July 26, 1948, President Harry S. Truman signed Executive Order 9981, declaring equality of treatment and opportunity throughout the United States Armed Forces, regardless of race. The order did not erase prejudice overnight. Military institutions rarely transform in a single day. But it established a new direction, one that would gradually reshape the Army Marie Collins had once served. For many Black Army nurses, the change came too late. By then, many had already returned to civilian life. Their years of service had passed with little public recognition. No victory parades celebrated the women who had spent the war inside military hospitals. No famous photographs captured their daily routine. History often records dramatic moments. The quieter forms of service are easier to overlook, yet they matter no less. Every bandage changed, every infection prevented, every patient stabilized. Those moments rarely appeared in headlines. Together, they helped sustain an army at war. Marie Collins was one of hundreds of Black Army nurses whose careers reflected both the promise and the contradictions of wartime America.
She did not become famous. She did not command troops. She did not leave behind speeches that entered history books. Instead, she left something less visible. An example. Each day she reported for duty, she demonstrated that professional excellence could not be measured by race. Each patient she treated quietly challenged assumptions that had limited generations of Black nurses before her. She did not argue that truth. She practiced it. Today, the United States Army Nurse Corps is profoundly different from the institution Marie Collins entered during World War II. Black nurses serve throughout military medicine, including in senior leadership positions. Their presence reflects decades of change shaped by countless individuals whose names are rarely remembered outside military history. That progress did not begin with a single law, nor with a single speech. It was built over time by people who continued serving even when equality remained incomplete. Marie Collins belonged to that generation. Perhaps that is why her story deserves a place alongside the better-known histories of the Second World War. Not because it changes how the war was fought, but because it changes how we understand those who fought it. When people remember World War II, they often picture beaches, tanks, bombers, and battlefields. Far less often do they picture a military hospital in the Arizona desert. A nurse reviewing patient charts before sunrise. A captured German soldier receiving treatment from the very nation he had once fought against. Or the remarkable fact that the woman providing that care was still expected to serve within a segregated military. That quiet contradiction reveals something important about history. Progress is rarely complete. It often arrives in stages. Carried forward by ordinary people who continue doing their work even when the institutions around them have not yet lived up to their own ideals. Marie Collins never set out to become a symbol. She simply became a nurse. She fulfilled her duty. And in doing so, she became part of a generation that helped change the United States military, not through protest on the battlefield, but through unwavering professionalism inside its hospitals. Her story reminds us that history is not shaped only by those who command armies. Sometimes, it is shaped by the people who refuse to abandon their principles, even when those principles are not yet fully reflected in the world around them. That is why the story of Marie Collins, and the hundreds of Black Army nurses who served beside her, still deserves to be remembered today. If you enjoy forgotten stories from World War II, please subscribe and join us as we remember the moments history should never forget.